Why does the entire world, from the atheist to the devout, bow before a single temporal marker? Think about it for a moment. We're not talking about an emperor who conquered continents. We're not talking about a philosopher who founded schools of thought that lasted for centuries. We're talking about a man born in a backwater city of the Roman Empire, to a family with no wealth, no official record, no army, no throne. And yet, from that birth onward, all of humanity began to count time from that point. The atheist signs his documents using this calendar. The Muslim adapts it. The communist uses it. No revolution, no empire, no cultural reorganization has ever managed to erase that marker. Why? Why did the birth of one man in Judea paralyze the chronometer of the greatest empires on earth and redefine humanity's entire count of time? Rome controlled the known world. Greece had shaped Western thought. Babylon had established the standards of measurement, astronomy, and the calendar. These empires didn't lose control of time by accident. They lost it because something happened that no political or philosophical system was prepared to absorb. An axis was inserted into the center of history, and the weight of everything that came before and after began to revolve around it. What you call the year 2026 is not just an administrative date, it is a coordinate, a position inside a 6,000-year system that is approaching its 0 point. And when you understand the architecture behind this system, when you see that the 6 days of creation were not merely an origin story, but a temporal engineering project, the birth of Emmanuel stops being a religious event and becomes what it always was, the turning of the central gear in a clock that God set in motion before the first man ever drew breath. Isaiah saw the sign. He used a word, Alma, that doesn't simply mean young woman or maiden. It means something veiled, reserved, set apart for a specific moment. What Isaiah announced was not just a birth, it was a dimensional intervention at a point in history that had been calculated long before Abraham existed. And the prophet Hosea was even more precise. He didn't speak in vague terms, he used days. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up. 2 days. When you apply the key that the biblical text itself provides, that 1,000 years in the sight of the Lord are like 1 day, you discover that the last 2,000 years were not merely an interval between promise and fulfillment. They were the second day, and the third day is beginning. The clock is not just running, it is knocking at your door. In this video, you will understand why time was built in blocks of 2,000 years, why the birth of Emmanuel was the exact fold at the center of that structure, why modern society feels that time is accelerating, and what that means inside prophetic mathematics, and why everything Abraham began, everything the cross completed, and everything that is still to come converges on a single point that history tries to ignore but cannot erase. What is about to be revealed is not theology. It is sacred geometry. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Before Abraham was, I am. When Jesus spoke these words in the temple courtyard, the Pharisees picked up stones. Not because he had said something confusing, but because he had said something absolutely clear. He did not say, I was, which would have been merely a claim of pre-existence. He said, I am, the eternal present tense, the same name God had declared to Moses from the burning bush, Eye Asher Eye, I am who I am, pure being, existence unconditioned by time. Emmanuel did not begin in Bethlehem. He entered time in Bethlehem. Those are two completely different things. And when you begin to trace the appearances of Emmanuel within the clock before the incarnation, what you find is not isolated, mysterious appearances. You find a pattern, a presence that had been operating inside history from the very beginning, adjusting, protecting, revealing, preparing the ground for the moment when the architect would descend to dwell inside the very structure he had built. The rabbis had a name for this mysterious presence. They called it Malach YHWH, the angel of the Lord. But this angel behaved in a way no created angel ever did. When the angel of the Lord appears to Hagar in the desert, she exclaims, "I have seen the one who sees me." Not "I saw a messenger of God." She saw him. The presence that saw her was the divine presence itself. When the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, he says, "The Lord is with you." And the text immediately interchanges the names, treating the angel and the Lord as the same entity. When he appears to Manoah, Samson's father, and Manoah asks his name, the answer is, "Why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful?" Pele, wonderful, incomprehensible, beyond human ability to name. Isaiah would use that same word centuries later, "And his name shall be called Pele Yoetz, Wonderful Counselor." The same word, the same being, before and after Bethlehem, and the pillar of fire that guided Israel through the desert. The text in Exodus is careful with a detail that most people read without noticing. The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 10, unveils the hidden layer of that text. All drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. The rock was Christ. The pillar was Christ. The angel who went before them was Christ. Emmanuel was not waiting in Bethlehem while Israel wandered in the desert. He was there, guiding, sustaining, operating inside the clock he himself had created before entering it in incarnate form. And that radically changes the way you read the Old Testament. Every appearance of the angel of the Lord is a visit from Emmanuel before the incarnation. Every voice that came from Sinai carried the same source that would later say, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Every fire that descended on the altar was lit by the same hands that would later be pierced. The clock was not created by someone from the outside. It was created by someone who has always been inside it, sustaining every gear, calibrating every movement, operating at every critical point in history until the moment came to enter visibly, in flesh, at the 0 point. Bethlehem was not the beginning of Emmanuel. It was the revelation of who had always been there. And if he was there from the beginning, calibrating the clock from within, then what does that tell us about where he is now, in the final movements of the 6th day? The architect has not abandoned the clock. He never did. Rome did not lose the calendar by carelessness. It lost it because the calendar was taken, not by war, not by revolution, not by imperial decree. It was taken by a birth. And that alone should make anyone stop and ask, what kind of birth has that kind of power? The Roman Empire was the most sophisticated control machine of the ancient world. It controlled currency, language, roads, armies, and time. The Julian calendar was Rome's signature on reality. Every date carried the name of a Caesar, a general, or a Roman god. Time belonged to Rome the same way the Mediterranean belonged to Rome. And then came Bethlehem. There was no battle, there was no decree. But in the centuries that followed, the entire world began to count time from that birth. The very system that tried to kill that child ended up being devoured by the memory of him. Today, 2,000 years later, the name of Tiberius Caesar only exists in history books. The birth he tried to erase became the center of the calendar the whole world uses. That is not irony. That is precision. There is a word the rabbis use to describe the moment when God's hidden plan becomes visible in history: kairos. It is not chronological time, that is chronos, the time that passes, that is spent, that ages. Kairos is the right time, the exact moment. The window God opens only once, and when it opens, it reorganizes everything around it. The birth of Emmanuel was a kairos inserted inside chronos, and that is why it split the calendar in two. Not because men decided to honor him, but because the internal structure of time was designed to bend at that exact point, before and after, BC and AD, as if the very fabric of history had a seam, and that birth was the line where the two sides meet. But here's what no one ever told you. That 0 point was not improvised, it was calculated. There is an architecture behind the timeline that turns human history into something very different from a random sequence of events. And when you begin to see that architecture, when you see the blocks, the proportions, the fittings, you realize that the birth of Emmanuel was not merely a divine intervention. It was the central heartbeat of a clock that began ticking on the first day of creation. And right now, that clock is in its final movements. In the beginning, God did not just create. He structured 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. This is not merely the narrative of the universe's origin. It is the architectural model that governs all of human history. And the rabbis of the Second Temple period already knew this. The Babylonian Talmud records a tradition that few Christians know. The world will exist for 6,000 years and one destroyed. 2,000 of chaos, 2,000 of Torah, 2,000 the days of the Messiah. 2,000, 2,000, 2,000. This was not written after Christ to fit Christian theology. It was written before. And what it describes is a week, not of days, but of millennia. Each day of creation corresponds to 1,000 years of human history, and the seventh day, the Sabbath, corresponds to the millennium of the kingdom, the eternal rest that the prophets announced. Take this key and open history, from Adam to Abraham, approximately 2,000 years of chaos. Humanity without covenant, without direction, sinking into violence and idolatry, the flood, the Tower of Babel, the scattering of the nations, 2,000 years of darkness without structure, then Abraham, the covenant, the beginning of Torah as the spiritual foundation of humanity. And from there, another 2,000 years of construction, patriarchs, Moses, kings, prophets, the temple, exile, return, 2,000 years of law. And then, at the exact turning point of that second block, Emmanuel is born. Not in the middle, not at the beginning. At the transition point between the second and third millennium, on the threshold between the age of law and the age of the Messiah, as if the clock had struck, as if the gear had turned, as if God had said, the second day is over, the third day begins now. This is not theological coincidence. This is prophetic mathematics, and here is where the tension deepens. If the first 2 blocks of 2,000 years were fulfilled with this precision, chaos, Torah, Messiah, what happens when the third block reaches its end? What comes after the 2,000 years of the Messiah? What the prophets called the eternal Sabbath, the seventh day, the kingdom that will have no end. We are living in the final movements of the 6th day. Isaiah wrote something that disturbed rabbis for centuries. He was a prophet of precision, and in the middle of a book full of images of rupture and restoration, he wrote something that seems simple on the surface and is devastating once you understand its depth. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the Alma shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. The historical debate surrounding this word, Alma, is one of the most intense in all of biblical exegesis, because Alma is not the common word for woman, nor the technical word for virgin. It is a rare word, and the rarity of a word in Hebrew is never an accident. Alma comes from the root alam, which means hidden, concealed, veiled. The Alma is the one who was guarded, the one who was reserved, the one who was set apart for a purpose that had not yet been revealed. When Miriam is called Alma in Exodus, the text is not merely describing her age, it is describing her state. She was reserved for a role that no one had yet seen. Isaiah was not merely announcing a birth, He was announcing an intervention, and the name given to the Son reveals the nature of that intervention. Emmanuel, Immanuel in Hebrew, is not an honorific title. It is an ontological declaration. Immanu, with us. El, God. Not God blesses us, not God favors us. God, with us, present, incarnate, inside the structure of creation that He Himself had built. Here is what this means inside the architecture of time. If the 6,000-year clock was built by God, and if Emmanuel is God entering the time He Himself created, then the birth of Emmanuel is not just an event inside history. It is the architect descending to personally adjust the central gear of the clock, at the exact point, at the calculated moment, at the precise coordinate between the end of the second millennium and the beginning of the third. And here arises the question that will stay with you until the end of this video. If God entered time at that specific point to recalibrate the gear, what did He come to prepare? What was the third millennium, the third day, the sixth day of the millennial week being adjusted to receive? The answer is found in a prophet that most people read without understanding what they are reading, and it is mathematically disturbing. Hosea was not a prophet of comfort. He was a prophet of precision. In the middle of a book full of images of rupture and restoration, he wrote something that seems simple on the surface and is devastating once you understand its depth. After 2 days, He will revive us. On the third day, He will raise us up, that we may live before Him. Hosea 6:2, one sentence, 3 days, and a hidden key inside the structure of time that God had already revealed elsewhere. Psalm 94, 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday. Peter repeats the same key in his second letter. With the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. This is not poetry. It is hermeneutical instruction. It is God saying, when you read days in prophetic texts, know that there is a second layer of reading. Now apply Hosea's key. After 2 days, 2,000 years, He will revive us. On the third day, in the third millennium, He will raise us up. If Emmanuel's clock began counting from the birth of Christ, the 2,000 years of Hosea arrive exactly where we are now. 2 millennia of church history. 2 millennia of evangelization, persecution, reformation, expansion. 2 days. And Hosea says that after these 2 days, something changes, something resurges, something that was waiting begins to move. The third day is not a distant future. It is a present threshold. And here is the detail few people connect. When Jesus rose, He rose on the third day, not on the second, not after a week. On the third day, Paul declares in 1 Corinthians 15 that this resurrection was according to the Scriptures. According to which Scriptures? Hosea. Christ's resurrection on the literal third day was the prophetic shadow of the resurrection of the people on the millennial third day. The same structure, the same mathematics, the same architect, but there is still a deeper layer in this cryptography. If the 2,000 years of Hosea correspond to the age of the Messiah, the age we are living in, then what happens when this period ends is not the closing of history. It is the entrance into the Sabbath, the seventh day, the rest that the prophets described as a kingdom where God Himself will dwell with His own. And what is happening right now, in this moment, in this year, in this generation, is that the second day is ending, and the third is knocking at the door. God does not work with round numbers by accident. There is a numerical language that runs through all of Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, that is not numerology, not mysticism, not editorial coincidence. It is the signature of the architect inside the text. And when you learn to read that signature, the Bible stops being a book of stories and becomes a system of spiritual engineering with millimeter precision. The number 7 is the number of rest, completeness, and sealed covenant. The number 12 is the number of ordered government. 12 tribes, 12 apostles, 12 gates in the New Jerusalem. The number 40 is the number of testing, transition, and preparation for what comes next. 40 years in the desert, 40 days of fasting, 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension, and the number 2000, or 2 days in prophetic language, is the number of waiting between promise and fulfillment. The Hebrews called these appointed encounters modim. Modim, singular moed, does not simply mean feast as common translations suggest. It means appointed meeting, established time, a coordinate in time where God promised to be present. The 7 feasts of Leviticus are not religious rituals created by men. They are 7 meetings appointed by God on the calendar of history, and each one has been or will be fulfilled with mathematical exactness. Passover was fulfilled at the cross on the exact day. Pentecost was fulfilled at the descent of the Spirit on the exact day. The fall feasts, trumpets, atonement, tabernacles still await fulfillment, and they await it inside the structure of the 3rd millennial day that Hosea announced. This means history is not spinning out of control. It is following a script with dates, patterns, and signs that were placed in the text millennia ago, so that when we reach this moment, we would recognize where we are. And where we are is exactly where the numbers point, on the threshold of the final moed, at the final appointment, at the beating of the clock that Emmanuel set in motion. If you're looking for the layers that the religious system simplified, subscribe now and turn on the bell, because what comes next is where this mathematics becomes personal. There is a question that has divided theologians for 2,000 years. Did Jesus come to abolish the law or to fulfill it? The answer most people give is partial. He came to fulfill, correct. But what does fulfill mean? Does it mean to finish, to complete and discard? Does it mean the Torah became a museum piece after the cross? The superficial reading says yes. The deep reading reveals something completely different and far more disturbing. When Moses came down from Sinai with the stone tablets, he found the people dancing around a golden calf. And he broke the tablets. That detail, which seems like nothing more than an angry gesture, is actually a prophetic key of enormous weight. The law written on stone was broken before it even reached the people. And the Talmud records that the rabbis interpreted this breaking as a sign. The stone covenant was never the final destination. It was a shadow. It was a stage. Jeremiah announced what would come later. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it on their hearts. Not on stone, on the heart. Not external, imposed, demanded. Internal, living, breathing inside the human being. The transition Emmanuel carried out was not the abolition of the Torah. It was its transcoding, from an external code to an internal frequency. And here is the dimension very few teachers dare to articulate. When the Spirit descended at Pentecost, 50 days after the resurrection, on the exact day of Shavuot, the feast that commemorates the giving of the law at Sinai, God was sending a coded message to anyone who knew how to read it. On the same day, Israel received the law of stone, the church received the law of fire. Same day, same feast, different substrate. Stone breaks, fire transforms. This is what Emmanuel came to do at the 0 point of the clock. He did not end the age of the law. He raised its frequency. It stopped being an external code of conduct and became an internal nature. And that frequency shift is what altered the spiritual density of humanity. Because from that moment on, God's presence stopped dwelling in a temple of stone and began to dwell in a temple of flesh. In every human being who received that frequency, the temple was not destroyed only by Rome. It was replaced by something Rome could not touch. There is a phenomenon that scientists, philosophers, and theologians describe with different words, but all describe the same sensation. Time is accelerating. It is not an impression. It is not the nostalgia of an older generation that feels everything changed. It is a documented perception, transgenerational and transcultural. People in completely different cultures, with no contact with one another, report the same thing. Days seem shorter. Decades seem to compress. Events that once took generations to unfold now happen in years, in months. The world is moving at a speed no previous generation has experienced. Why? Quantum physics has a theory, cognitive psychology has another, but the Bible has an answer that precedes both, and that neither wants to openly cite. Jesus said, "If those days had not been shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened." Matthew 24:22, shortened days, compressed time, not as a metaphor, as chronological reality in the final movements of the clock. We are on the frontier of the seventh day. Think about what happens in the last hours of the sixth day, in the last hour of a Friday before the Sabbath. In Jewish tradition, that hour has a name. It is called Erev Shabbat, the eve of rest. And Erev Shabbat is not a time of quiet. It is a time of intense preparation. The house is cleaned, the table is set, the candles are lit. Because what comes next is so sacred that everything must be ready before the sun sets. The world you are seeing now, with all its fragmentation, with all its acceleration, with all its feeling that something is about to break, is not the collapse of the world. It is the Erev Shabbat of human history, the chaotic and intense preparation that precedes the greatest rest creation has ever known. And here is the weight of it. There is a generation that will be alive when the sixth day closes. There is a generation that will wake up on the morning of the seventh day. The scriptures do not say that this generation will be the most powerful, the most holy, or the most prepared. They say it will be the most pressured, the most tested, the one that will feel the weight of the final beats of Emmanuel's clock with an intensity no previous generation has felt. You are reading this now, in this year, at this coordinate. This is not an accident, this is positioning. Every architectural structure has a point of balance. In a suspension bridge, there is a central point where the tension from both ends meets. Remove that point and the structure collapses. Reinforce that point and it can bear a weight that neither end could support alone. Human history works the same way, and the cross is that point. Not the cross as a religious symbol, the cross as a structural coordinate. On one side, Abraham, the father of faith, the man who received the promise that his seed would bless all nations. The promise was made approximately 2,000 years before Christ. On the other side, the kingdom, the full fulfillment of everything the prophets announced, the eternal Sabbath, the third millennial day that Hosea described, approximately 2,000 years after Christ, and at the exact center, equidistant from both ends, the cross. Abraham went up Mount Moriah with his son. He carried wood. He carried fire. He carried a knife. And when he reached the top, the son asked, "My father, here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered with a phrase that the rabbis called involuntary prophecy. God will provide for himself the lamb. The Hebrew verb used is not simply future tense. It is yira. God will see, God will provide, God will appear. And the place became known as Waishu Yira, the Lord will appear. 2,000 years later, on the same mountain, because Calvary is on the same mountain range as Moriah, God appeared as a lamb, with wood on his shoulders, with fire of suffering in his lungs. And what Abraham prophesied without fully understanding, the cross answered with a precision that bends any honest intellectual skepticism. The axis was not built afterward. It was planned beforehand. The line that runs from Abraham to the kingdom has a central point that sustains the weight of both ends, and that point has a name: Emmanuel, God with us, at the exact center of history. There is a question that Christian history books rarely ask. If the birth of Emmanuel split the calendar in two, if the entire world began to count time from that point, why, in the centuries that followed, did the very system that adopted the name of Christ work so systematically to erase the original coordinates of that clock? Why did an institution that claimed to follow Jesus remove the very elements that Jesus himself observed? The answer begins in the year 321 AD. Constantine, the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity, signed a decree that seemed harmless on the surface. He transferred the official day of rest from Saturday, the seventh day, the Sabbath that God had sanctified at creation, to Sunday, the first day of the week, the day of the sun in the Roman calendar. The theological justification came later. The political decision came first, and with it, something was quietly disconnected. The Sabbath was not just a ritual. It was a temporal coordinate. It was the weekly sign of the millennial week. Every time Israel observed the seventh day, it was unconsciously declaring that history had a structure. 6 days of human work, 1 day of divine rest. Every Sabbath was a reminder built into the body and the calendar that time was marching toward a planned end. Remove the Sabbath, and you remove the hand of the clock that God had placed inside humanity's weekly routine. But Constantine did not stop at the Sabbath. The Council of Nicaea in 325 reorganized the calculation of Easter so that it would never again coincide with the Jewish Passover. The decree was explicit: we must have nothing in common with that people. And what was being erased was not just a date. It was the connection between fulfillment and shadow, between Christ's Passover and the Passover of the Exodus, between the lamb slain in the first century and the lamb slain in Egypt. The same feast, the same moed, the same architect. When you cut the connection between shadow and fulfillment, you lose the mathematics. And losing the mathematics means losing the ability to read the clock. It means entire generations of believers began celebrating the resurrection without understanding that it was fulfilled on the exact day of the moed that God had marked in Leviticus. It means Christian Pentecost lost its connection to the Hebrew Shavuot, and with it, the revelation that God was sending the Spirit on the same day he had given the law, showing that the new covenant was not a break with the old, but its elevation. The forbidden calendar is not lost. It is preserved in the scriptures. Every moed, every feast, every seventh year, every jubilee, it is all still there, waiting to be read by those who have eyes to see. And what these patterns reveal, when you read them without the layer of distortion that centuries of separatism installed, is disturbing in its precision. The spring feasts were fulfilled at the first coming. The fall feasts await the second, and the interval between them, the time in which we live, is exactly the period that Hosea called 2 days. The system did not erase the clock, it only tried to make you stop looking at it. This is not a video of fear. Fear paralyzes. And a clock that is approaching its end does not need to generate paralysis. It needs to generate orientation. It needs to ask the question that really matters. If time is structured this way, if the mathematics is real, if the prophets were precise, what do you do with it now? There is an expression the prophets used to describe the people who understood the time in which they lived. The tribe of Issachar is described in 1 Chronicles as men who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. Not just men who knew time was passing, men who knew what to do inside the time they were in. Yodeh bin Alaytim, those who had understanding of the times. That is the difference between the spectator who watches history happen and the participant who understands where he stands inside history. It is not a matter of spiritual elite. It is a matter of alignment. You align yourself with what the clock is marking, or you live as if time were infinite and the coordinates did not matter. And here is what the clock is marking now. We are in the Erev Shabbat of human history, on the eve of the seventh day. And what you do on the eve of the Sabbath is not to rest before the rest. It is to prepare. It is to light the candles. It is to set the table. It is to call those who are outside to come in before the sun sets. Every life that understands this moment and aligns with it is not just saved from something. It is positioned for something, for a role inside the greatest event creation has ever witnessed. The code is not hidden for a few enlightened ones. It is written in the prophets, in the numbers, in the patterns, in the Moedim, in the structure of the millennial week. It is accessible to anyone who stops reading the Bible as a collection of edifying stories and begins to read it for what it is. The operating manual of the clock that Emmanuel set in motion. The clock is ticking. The question is not whether you heard it. The question is what you are going to do now that you have heard it. Time is not your enemy, it is your context. Everything revealed in this video points to a single conclusion. You are not living in a random period of history. You are positioned at a specific coordinate inside a 6,000-year structure that was designed before creation. Chaos, 2,000 years. Torah, 2,000 years. Messiah, 2,000 years. And the seventh day, the eternal Sabbath, knocking at the door of this generation. The birth of Emmanuel was not merely the beginning of the calendar the world uses. It was the activation of the central axis of all existence, the point where Abraham and the kingdom meet, where promise and fulfillment embrace, where the law of stone is transformed into the law of fire. Everything Isaiah saw in the Alma, everything Hosea encoded in the 2 days, everything the mathematics of the covenant reveals in the Moedim, everything the forbidden calendar tried to hide, points to this moment, not to tomorrow, to now. The acceleration you feel is not collapse. It is Erev Shabbat. It is the intensity of the eve of something the entire creation is waiting for. And the response to that intensity is not fear, it is alignment. It is understanding the times as the tribe of Issachar understood them. It is knowing where you are inside the clock and what that demands of you. The world used the birth of Emmanuel to mark time without understanding what it was marking. You now know what it is marking. Emmanuel's clock is not late. It never has been. The seventh day has an address. Most people hear seventh day and think of rest. They think of absence, of silence, of something that comes after everything is over, like the silence after the music stops. A pause, a sacred void. And that reading, as widespread as it is, completely inverts what the prophets were describing. Because the seventh day is not the end of history. It is the destination toward which all of history has always pointed. There is a fundamental difference between end and destination. The end is where something stops. The destination is where something arrives. And when the prophets described the eternal Sabbath, they did not use the language of closure. They used the language of arrival. Isaiah does not say the world will fade away. He says creation will be renewed. Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. Not extinction, recreation. The same architect who built the clock on the first day is the same one who will inaugurate what comes after the sixth. The seventh day has an architecture, and that architecture was described with a precision that hurried devotional reading cannot absorb. Ezekiel spent 28 chapters describing a temple that was never built in the history of Israel. Exact dimensions, precise cardinal orientations, priests positioned, water flowing from inside the sanctuary going eastward, making the Dead Sea sweet, causing life to bloom where there had only been salt and silence. Interpreters who read Ezekiel as symbolic literature could never explain why God would spend 28 chapters on symbolism that would never materialize. The most honest answer is that Ezekiel was not describing a symbol, he was describing an address. The seventh day has an address. And that address is not floating in some ethereal dimension outside space and time. It is anchored on the same mountain range where Abraham went up with his son, where Solomon built the first temple, where the cross was raised. The line that runs through all the architecture of Emmanuel's clock, from Abraham to the kingdom, is not metaphorical. It is geographical. The architect did not change addresses between creation and consummation. He has been building at the same coordinate from the beginning. But there is an even deeper layer in this structure, and it is hidden inside the Jubilee system. The Jubilee was not merely a social event of economic redistribution. It was a clock inside the clock. Every 7 years the land rested, the Shemitah, the sabbatical year. And every 7 cycles of 7 years, 49 years, the 50th year was declared sacred, the Jubilee. The year when everything returned to its original state. Slaves were freed, land was returned, debts were cancelled. Time made a movement of total restoration, as if creation took a deep breath and began again from the point of origin. Paul understood what the Jubilee was foreshadowing. When he writes in Romans that creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God, when he says that creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the glorious freedom of the children of God, he is using Jubilee language. All creation is in a cosmic Shemitah cycle, 6 millennia of work, struggle, and accumulated entropy, and the 7th millennium is the ultimate Jubilee. The liberation not of one nation, not of one generation, but of the entire created structure, of time, matter, and death itself. That is what the 7th day means. It is not where history stops. It is where the Jubilee of creation is proclaimed. And here is the detail that closes the argument with disturbing precision. The book of Revelation describes what happens at the inauguration of the 7th millennium with an image most people read as poetic. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband, coming down, not appearing suddenly in the void, coming down. The same movement Emmanuel made in Bethlehem, the same movement the Spirit made at Pentecost, the same pattern repeated on an ever-increasing scale. The architect descends to dwell inside the structure, first in a body, then in a community, then in a city, then in a new creation. The pattern does not change, only the scale increases. And that means the 7th day is not the arrival of something completely new and unknown. It is the arrival of what has always been in preparation, millennium after millennium, feast after feast, fulfillment after fulfillment. What Abraham saw from afar and greeted, what Moses could not enter but announced, what the prophets described with words that could barely contain the weight of what they were seeing, what the cross made possible at the central point of the clock. All of it converges not in dissolution, but in habitation, God dwelling with his own, completely, without veil, without shadow, without intermediary. Emmanuel, God with us, not as a historical title of a birth in Bethlehem, but as the permanent reality of a 7th day that will never have an 8th. And that is why the clock does not generate fear when you truly understand it, because what is coming is not the end of everything you love. It is the arrival of everything that was promised, the acceleration you feel, the compression of time, the sensation that structures are giving way. This is not the universe collapsing. It is the scaffolding being removed because the building is ready. The scaffolding was never the destination, the building is. You are living in the last days of the scaffolding. And when the final scaffolding falls, what will remain standing will not be what men built with stone and power. It will be what the architect has always been building. From the first day, through the 0 point of Bethlehem, across the 2 days of Hosea, arriving at the 3rd day that is knocking at the door of this generation.